in now, and I think more will join as I'm doing the introductions. So my name is Nicola Wilson, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing at the University of Reading. In terms of the seminar today, we've got two speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. They'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes about the new database that they've been working on, and we'll have Q&A at the end, so I'll invite people to come on audio or pop questions in the chat at that point, and I'll monitor the chat as well as we're going on and pick things up from there as well also. The session has been recorded. You should all have had that info when you joined. And I think that's it for housekeeping now. We're all kind of getting quite familiar, aren't we, with Zoom sessions. So I'll introduce the two speakers. Professor Michelle O'Callaghan is Professor of Early Modern Literature at the University of Reading. The most recent book is Crafting Poetry Anthologies in Renaissance England, Early Modern Cultures of Recreation, which came out with Cambridge last year. And that builds on a previous digital edition she worked on called Miscellanies Online, which she co-edited with Alice Eardley. She's written previous books on Thomas Middleton as a Renaissance dramatist, on literature and sociability in early modern England, and her first book was called The Jacobeans, Spenserians, and looked at early Stuart political culture. Our second speaker, speaking with Michelle, we've worked on this project obviously together, is Jake Arthur, who is a DPhil candidate and Clarendon Scholar at the University of Oxford. His thesis examines early modern women's work in translation and paraphrase, and seeks to reclaim the expressive intellectual possibilities of what are known as derivative works, which sounds fascinating. He is co-editor of the poetry section of the forthcoming Palgrave Encyclopaedia of Early Modern Women's Writing, and is working as a researcher on a couple of Australian Research Council funded projects, of which one is the one that we're going to hear more about today. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Michelle and Jake.
Okay, well, I'll speak first and then Jake will go through the index. Jake, could you click on the About page? Thank you. So I'm just going to introduce the project. The project is an index of early modern women's complaint poetry, and it's funded, you can just see the logos down the bottom there. It's funded by the Australian Research Council, and that was on a project headed by Rosalind Smith, who's now at ANU, so she was the PI on that project, and also by the Marsden Fund, and Sarah Roth was the PI on that project. They can't be with us today because it's in the early hours of the morning in Australia and in New Zealand. We also have on the project Jake, who is my co-presenter here. He was the researcher on the project and responsible for collating the data behind the index, and also liaising with Mitchell Whitelaw. And Mitchell Whitelaw is the digital designer on the project, and they are really the linchpins of the project. The index itself is part of a larger project that explores how early modern women engaged with complaint as a poetic mode, and it's already resulted in a volume of essays, and Sarah, Ros and I are working on a co-authored monograph on the poetry of complaint. So why early modern women's complaint poetry? The project emerged out of an interest in the poetry of complaint, especially female-voiced complaint, and the very pressing questions that it raises around gender, voice, and politics. And at the same time, the project was also a response to a gap in the scholarship at that time. In the case of early modern women, in the case of early modern England, the poetry of female voice complaint has largely been studied as a male author tradition in which women were ventriloquized by male poets, but women themselves did not author complaints. What our research indicated, and the subsequent database has demonstrated, is that this is clearly not the case. Early modern women did write complaint poetry, but more than this, when we began identifying the types of metadata, for example, thinking about how to classify and record agency, collecting bibliographic information, what our work began to reveal was that women not only authored complaint, but also took part in a wide range of extra authorial activities involved in literary production, such as transcribing and annotating poems, compiling collections, and performing poems as songs. And so one of the aims of the index is to allow users to explore the ways in which women were engaged in these very complex networks of poetic production, performance, and exchange through the poetry of complaint. The process of designing the database, thinking about what should be tagged and so made searchable, what type of information to include, and so forth. These questions were obviously informed by our research, by what we did know, but it was also a very useful sort of hands-on work in designing the database. It functioned as a type of research exercise. It not only helped to refine our own research questions, but it also posed very sharply questions around definitions and distinctions that were very productive in thinking about complaint as a literary mode, and also wider issues around authorship, agency, and literary production. Jake, can you scroll down to how we define a complaint author? Thanks. So when compiling the database behind the index, there have been a number of very tricky definitional issues that we have had to address. And one of the most interesting has been the question of how to record agency, which obviously has implications for how we think about authorship, both in terms of complaint as a mode, but also at the level of individual texts. So the project began by using the term female authored. However, as more examples were collected and questions arose about what to include and what to exclude, it became apparent that this descriptor was way too limited and wouldn't allow us to capture the range and complexity of how women participated in literary production. And this realization coincided with recent scholarship that was rethinking authorship, complicating the figure of the proprietorial singular author to think about authorship as more diffused, collaborative, and part of a co-creative process. So the umbrella category used in the database is female agent, which does include author, but also other activity, such as translator, transcriber, or compiler. Okay, could you now scroll down to speaker's gender? Thank you. Speaker's gender raised similar kinds of very difficult interpretive issues that the index aimed to capture by using a fine-grained taxonomy. And this fine-grained taxonomy, as I'll point out in a second, is also on the move. So complaint is so often about voice and voicing, especially female voiced complaint. And the questions that we wanted to explore were how often women used a female speaker or ventriloquized male speakers. And in doing so, we became very aware of the complex gendering of voice in complaint. So 6 classes were introduced: female explicit implicit, male explicit implicit, open, and at first we did use open has now become multiple, and unknown is now open. So I'll just run through that. So explicit, as you can see on the screen, is male or female. It's used where the speaker is clearly gendered by vocabulary, pronouns, or proper nouns. Implicit is used where a first-person lyric speaker is assumed to have the same gender of the author, unless otherwise indicated. And using the implicit tag helps us to distinguish works where we've made these assumptions from poems where there is clear textual evidence for the gender of the speakers. And these have been labelled female explicit and male explicit. Now, open, as I've said, has now become multiple, and it's used when the speaking position is available to multiple speakers, male and female. And unknown is now open, and it's used where there's no indication of who is speaking, as in first-person perspective songs or dialogues personifying entities such as castle and so forth. So can you take me to the team, please? Can you scroll down to Mitchell? Okay. Now, one of the most exciting features of the project has been the opportunity to collaborate with Mitchell Whitelaw, who's Professor of Design in the School of Art and Design at ANU. And his particular design interest is in the generous interface, which allows users to explore the richness and complexity of the data that has been gathered and stored on sites. Jake, can you take me to explore? Up the top. Thank you. Yeah. So this is an example of the generous interface, which aims to offer these multiple ways into a digital collection in ways that support a more open-ended exploration and process of discovery, as well as allowing for more conventional search functions. So you can see explore at the top of the menu, and then you will also have the more conventional search functions that allow for more focused inquiries that enables users to find specific information. Now, alongside the explore and search, we also have discoveries. And discovery, on the discovery page, this talks through some of our findings from exploring the database and illustrates how the index can be used to formulate research questions, to enrich interpretation, to sort of generate comparisons and so forth. So that's me. I'll now hand over to Jake, who's going to talk you through the database in a bit more detail and the index.
Sorry. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I'll just talk about the generous interface for a bit and kind of walk through the way that we've, well, I would say we've presented, but Mitchell has presented the information that we've provided here and the kind of taxonomies that we've developed. So as you can see here along the top, we've got a series of different facets. And these are our highest level category for sorting the information that we have about the 512 complaint poems we've collected and that have the involvement of a female agent in some role, for example, author, transcriber, compiler, translator. So at the moment you see it by agent, so that's by female agent, and we've got the names of the women involved and the number of poems represented by the dots that you see here that they were involved in. And if you were to hover over any individual dot, then that would represent one of those poems. And as you can see, the title comes up here. More about that in a second. We've also got complaint type. So this is kind of the highest level categorization of kind of subgenres of complaint, you might say. So we've got amatory, religious, existential, complaint against the times, etc. Female voiced is one that a lot of an individual poem can be linked to multiple complaint types at the same time. So it could be both religious and political, of course, and it could be religious and female voiced. So female voice is just a way to indicate that the speaker's gender is explicit, because we thought that one of the things that researchers would most want to find from this database is complaints written by women that also feature women speakers. So that's complaint type. And I'll talk about how we can work with these together in a second. But poetic form, got lyric, sonnet, a song, and also, as you can see, like a really clear breakdown of just how frequent those are in the corpus that we've collected. Sonnets are really highly represented. We've also got quite a lot of psalms. If you're wondering about the colors, I will explain soon. The markers over here. Markers is a category that we developed to kind of think about how the complaint was lodged. So not why the complaint happened in the first place, which we called cause, but the way in which it's framed or lodged. So, and as an appeal to authority, seeking redemption, a sort of philosophical rumination. These categories can have slightly quirky names, but we're working with quite an eclectic subject matter. So one of the difficult things was developing these categories. And again, many of these, many poems can have multiple markers. Devices refers to the specific kind of literary devices that you tend to get in complaint poems and how they're represented across the corpus. So first person complaints are really common. Complainers often thought of as a kind of utterance in the style of a lament. So that is really highly featured, and we've got many others as well, prosopopeia, classical allusion, etc. Cause refers to the cause for the complaint, what led the person, the speaker, to complain in the first place. So it could be a lover's absence, betrayal, physical suffering, isolation, rejection, fear of death, any number of things. If you ever feel a bit self-pitying, you can come here and choose a reason, but also kind of unusual ones, less frequent ones down the bottom as well. And then speaker's gender, as Michelle has just explained. So we've got those categories there, multiple and open being the renamed types that we've got. Cool, so if we have a look at clicking on some of these and actually using this interface, if we click on Lady Mary Roth, who's our most frequent contributor of complaint poems to our corpus, you can see that her name comes up along that black bar along the bottom with 117 poems in total. And then if you scroll down, each of those poems is listed below in a card. And there's all 117 that will show up there. So an awful lot, and we can narrow that down, but just to talk briefly about how this works and to explain the colors of these dots. So you'll see that under Mary Roth, there's a lot of pink dots, there's some black, there's some green, and what that refers to is complaint type. So we've actually color-coded each complaint type with a different colored circle, just to give you a kind of visual reference and a kind of immediate visual reference of the broad style or subgenre that complaint represents. So here it's both amatory and it's female voiced. And all of these are clickable. You can use them to kind of reset the explore function along the line of that facet. So if I clicked amatory, then it will sort everything by the amatory poems. But more about that in a second. Okay. So we've also got, so because we've got those two complaint types that are relevant to this poem, you see in the corner, in the top right corner here, we've got that double colored circle to represent that. And that's why some of the circles just have so many different colors, because they fit into multiple complaint types. So what have we got here on this card? So quite a lot of data we've collected here, the most important being the name of the author, and then the first line or the title of the poem. So something that we wanted to replicate in a digital form here is a version of the first line index that you might get in a traditional edition of poetry. So in this case, we've got that in quite a prominent position. We've got the date, the assumed date of composition. If we don't know about the composition or if it's in print, then we will put the print date there. The length, the location in the text, and then that refers to the source given below here. And the type of complaint, the poetic form, we actually don't collect full texts for the poems, but when possible, we link a transcription of them to a reputable source. So we have these kind of open source links. So this is kind of what makes this an index rather than a database, because it doesn't actually replicate the text. It doesn't have editions of the text there, but it gives you enough information that we hope you can both find the texts if you need to, but also get a sense of what they're going to be about. And some of these texts are harder to find than others. Some of them are in manuscript, some of them are unedited, but we hope that by giving the amount of content-based information that we've given, you can kind of make some inferences about whether this might be useful for the research that you're doing. So in the content category, we've got that speak agenda that we've already talked about, some keywords that are really prominent in the poem, and then the markers, devices, causes, and the source. So here we've got the manuscript of the manuscript source with Pamphylia to Emphalanthus, which is the origin text, and we've also got the print edition below. Okay, so if I click on amatory complaint, for example, then that now sorts by the amatory complaint type as a facet. So the black bar is now searching by that. So what that's showing us here in terms of this visualization is that amatory complaints tend to often be female voiced because they're lit up in both categories, but they also sometimes overlap with existential complaints, complaints against the time, etc. So that's an easy way of visualizing that. But you can also combine different facets from different categories to kind of really narrow down what you want to look at. So we might look, for example, if we subtract away the facet that we have, you might want to look at occasional poems and then go back to complaint type and funnel down into complaints against the time. So that would be now along the black bar with 9 poems, and they'll be listed here. And you can see that tricolor now with the 3 complaint types of this poem and this poem. Okay, I'll just get rid of those ones. You can also do kind of you could, for example, be interested in a female speaker, explicit evidence in the poem that it's a female speaker, and then be looking through markers and think, oh, I'd quite like to see if there are any poems in which the speaker is definitely a woman and it has women represented as alone. So sorry, I didn't click that, but if you click on the funnel, then it narrows it down to that set of poems that represent both of those facets. So just a way of visualizing that and quickly cutting down into the content that you're specifically interested in. Just a little bit about authorship. If we look, for example, at political complaints, and the first one here is Margaret Moore Roper, How Can the Soul That Loves Her God? So this is a poem that has contested attribution. We've added some additional information here about the attribution so that people can kind of go and check that debate and see what they themselves think about it. But when we've identified the agent role above, we've just added a question mark to indicate that it's contested, and usually we'll add information here. So we're trying not to kind of take a stance or shift that attribution debate, but we have taken a sort of generous inclusion criteria and included these poems that are debatable in order to kind of continue those discussions and make those things accessible. And also just another example, if we go to Psalms and have a look at, say, Mary Sidney's Psalms and her involvement in the Sydney Psalter, you can see just how much information sometimes we ended up having to collect in terms of sources. So for the Sydney Psalter, it exists across 18 extant manuscripts that we know about, and whichever of those manuscripts have this particular poem, Psalm 44, in them, we have endeavored to list in the additional sources category. So this might be a really useful bibliographic reference point if you're interested in that psalm, as well as having these kind of content-based and complaint-specific interests as well. I'm conscious that I'm using up the time, but let's just flick over to the search function and explain how this might work. So this is a very basic website in the sense that everything is text-based and therefore searchable. So the search function only searches for the text on the card that you see here. It doesn't search any kind of back data in behind the scenes, and it also doesn't allow you to do a kind of complicated Boolean search. But you could search, for example, anything on that card. So I could search prison, and that would capture those keywords that you saw down here, and also the first line and last line. Unfortunately, it can't capture the whole poem and whether prison comes up in the poem as a whole because we don't have the full text included. But this is just a way to get like an additional way to kind of narrow down your interests if they're not searchable by those facets that we've predetermined. So I could search, for example, fill amount, and then we've got 4 entries that match that. Or for complaint, which is very often has an echo figure, you can search echo, and if we've got that in the first line, the last line, or the title, and in the keywords, then it will come up. And we've tried to indicate important keywords like echo throughout. And you can see here with Lady Anne Blount, she's listed here as the transcriber and compiler. So I could also search transcriber, and all the transcribed entries would come up. Same with translator. You could also search by the type of source that you're looking for. So I could search, for example, a songbook. So something we've captured here under source is context type. So context as in the context for the poem. The poem is in a manuscript songbook. So you could search manuscript, you could search songbook. You could search, for example, drama and see Lady Jane Cavendish's complaint poems within her drama, her play. And you could search a location or a repository like the Bodleian and find all the poems that are listed as having iterations contained in that repository. So that's just a kind of general introduction to the functionality of the database. I hope that made sense. I guess the idea with the facets that we've included here is to give users a new sense of the corpus. I mean, first of all, that the corpus exists in the first place, but a sense of just how much there actually is there, the 512 poems that we've investigated, and how many interconnections exist between them, and to give scholars a way to kind of see the connections and actually see the connections visually between these different works. And from that, I hope to, or we all hope, to give like a new sense of the vitality of the mode and the kind of cultural currency that it had for women at this time. So I'll finish there and we'll move on to questions.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. It gave us a really helpful overview of what you put together. The search functionality looks really helpful. I will kick off with a couple of questions, but I wonder if people want to put cameras on now so it kind of feel a little bit more conversation, that'd be great.
I don't want to out her because I know it's something like 5 a.m. in the morning, but I know that Sarah Ross is in the room. She could say hi in the chat if I do. I know this is a bit mean because it's so early in the morning, but Sarah is one of the PIs on the project. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Sarah. You might be in your pajamas, but
yes, she's probably cursing me for doing this to her. Yes.
Yeah, and if anyone would like to drop questions or comments in the chat, you can do. I think we've got the raise hand functionality as well. If anyone wants to just ask a question that way as well, you're very welcome to. I wonder, could I just start by asking you to say a little bit more about, or to explain like the contours of your corpus a little bit more, and how you reach this kind of figure of 500, and yeah, and just a little bit more about that, really, to kind of understand the context of the corpus.
Jake, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, trial and error, I would say. I mean, it's quite a diffuse term, complaint, generically, and it's one that hasn't necessarily been the prevailing term for a lot of these poems. So in a way, we're kind of defining it as we're defining it anew by making this kind of addition of complaint poems, and it's an intervention in that, in a generic sense as well. I think it's probably unusual that we chose to combine the complaint types that we did, and to put amatory complaint together with complaint against the times, together with kind of, medical complaints about, oh, I'm very sore and I've got agues. But we saw so many commonalities between them, and actually having those markers that we developed over time and seeing how they mapped across these very different concerns helped us to kind of refine that sense. But I would say absolutely it was something that evolved from the text that we were reading. I mean, of course, we started with authors that we kind of knew would have complaint poems there, and the further we read out from there, the more we found, and it was a long process, and I'm sure we'll still find more and more. And also, I think this isn't the end of that conversation, and we just wanted to get the ball rolling. I think, what would you say, Michelle?
Yes, yes. I mean, Jake read so many poems, and we had regular Zoom meetings across different continents, where we really did discuss in a great deal of detail, is this complaint, what might make it complaint. So it is interesting that the way that this process makes you think about not just about various taxonomies, but also the problems with taxonomies, and the way that individual texts will spill over into other categories. And so the richness of the markers and the complaint types aims to capture that kind of mobility and capaciousness of complaint.
That's great, thank you. So yeah, if anyone would like to ask questions from the floor, please do kind of raise your hand, or drop things in the chat as well, or just kind of come on audio. And I guess like a similar kind of question about kind of contours as well. You have so many there's a big question coming through with them. You've got so many kind of taxonomies for your different kind of markers and things. Again, it would be just interesting to understand a bit more about where how you defined those and where the limits lay again.
In terms of the different markers? And so
well, just in terms of both the different categories at the top and then the things that you decided to tag.
They come from scholarship on complaint. So there is a body of scholarship on complaint poetry, and they also come through our own research, writing and dialogue on complaint. I can see that there's questions coming through. That
there are, yes, let's have a look at.
Yeah, I think that question that's just come through is really apt.
Yeah.
Limiting. Okay, yeah. Could religious complaint go to political against times?
Yeah. I mean, this goes into the sense of when you are trying to make these distinctions, you do need search terms, and search terms to are bounded in particular ways. But that can generate discussion, and the way that Jake was talking about how various types overlap and complicate each other. So yes, I agree. It is an issue. There is a lot of fluidity, but you do have to make distinctions, and some types of political complaints are distinctly political and complaints against the times, and religious complaints, some are distinctly religious. So you can make distinctions, but there are always going to be lines are always going to be blurred. But I guess it's the multiplicity that is captured in the index that allows you to precisely see this kind of multiplicity. And it's just, you know, if you look at the colours, and we did spend a lot of time thinking about the colours, it does give you a representation, a very visual representation of that blurring and movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, often complaints would be tagged under multiple categories at once. So these aren't totally hard and fast divisions. That said, I guess this question also goes to kind of the heart of the matter of capturing such a range, such a varied genre, but trying to make it accessible in some way. And that's really exactly trying to balance 21st century assumptions with, you know, the reality of 16th and 17th century literary production. So, you know, our distinction between religion and politics might be more robust, well, definitely was more robust, is more robust than theirs was. But then as a user, you know, you are coming from that set of assumptions. So I think we need to, you know, we do need to pay heed to those to some extent in order to make it, to make that range accessible. Yeah. It's a balancing act, and we've come across that all the time, and there's often really difficult lines to draw.
And did you find any kind of like surprises in terms of when you were kind of recategorizing and tagging and things? I noticed like poverty was very slight, or like one poem was related to that, and were there things like that challenged the research?
Yeah, there were numerous challenges. I mean, it's interesting, and with something like poverty, I mean, I guess it's difficult because you're like, well, there might be a passing comment to something that could be interpreted as poverty, but whether it's sort of the defining cause or one of the defining causes that originated the complaint is sort of a different question. So it's kind of trying to discern, you know, what's really important to this poem. And I think, you know, the comprehensiveness question applies there. You know, we attempted to be comprehensive with the corpus that we collected, but even being comprehensive with what you tag within one poem is almost impossible. You know, you would have to basically tag word by word, just put a whole edition up. So that was one of the problems. In terms of surprising things, yeah, I mean, some of my favorites are the kind of medical ones, and complaining about, you know, the difficulties of aging and things like that, and the unusual combinations that you do get in these complaint poems between, you know, quite different areas to complain about. I think that's part of the fun, and you get a sense of a lived experience through some of these poems.
Okay, I'll just so we've got a hello from New Brunswick, Canada, where a women's writing class. Hello, they are enjoying the presentation. There's a question there about if you think the poems should be considered representative, or if you're trying to be comprehensive, which I guess goes back to that initial question about the contours of the projects. I don't know if you want to.
Well, I mean, it's as comprehensive as we could be as we came to the end of the project. So we were working on this project since 2017, and was it this year that, no, it was this year that we finished.
Yes.
Finished.
Yes.
So
Yes, so it has been a process of discovery. As Jake said, we began with a group of women writers that we didn't know wrote complaint, and then further research brought more examples into the fold. But I think all of us would say you cannot be comprehensive. There may be other examples that others come across, but it's certainly not sort of saying these. It's not attempting to be canonical. It's not attempting to establish a canon of early modern women's complaint poetry as such. It's recognizing that further examples of women's complaint poetry may be discovered.
Yeah, I mean, part of the project is to say, this was a really vibrant mode. So in fact, finding more in the future is exactly what we kind of expect in a way. I mean, initially we were expecting way fewer poems, and Sarah, I know Sarah and I were talking about this. We were so surprised to reach 512. And, by the end, I was looking at things like songbooks, manuscript songbooks in the Bodleian that had been compiled by women. And that wasn't even on our radar at the beginning. It was much more of a kind of who's who of more recognizable figures that we managed to broaden that through our reading. And I think it's richer as a result, but it's not definitive as a result.
Yeah, it was really interesting when you were talking about the distinction between moving from like the idea of female author to the female agent and that much broader sense of compilers and translators. That seems really, really useful with this project as well. Okay, we have got let's have a look. There is a question, a more DH question. So there's a question about the what kind of CMS system this is built in. We're very much interested in the contents visualization, the digital tools used. Francesca seen it and also your compliments that it looks really effective to look at. So I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to the generous interfaces idea as well. I've not come across that myself. But
I mean, I wish I could speak to it more. I think Michelle and I will both say that.
Yes, I think, yeah, Mitchell has worked with a lot of museums in particular, designing their website, and that's his idea of the generous interface, is to try and move away from the idea of a sort of boxed in search engine that is very directed to exploring, I guess, the rich spatiality of a collection of a digital collection and finding ways into that through design features. So you can see I'm avoiding the question about which CMS he used because I don't know, but if you look him up via the website, he has examples of the projects that he has worked on. Yeah,
I'm sure he'd be happy to answer
yes.
any questions directed to him about it. I mean, we were so lucky to have him because, as you can tell, we're that's not our specialty, but I'm sure he'd be happy to answer those kind of technical questions.
Okay.
Go on, I was just going to say the dialogues that we had were just so productive. I mean, working with a digital design person on a project, it was a very stimulating and productive thing to do, and just what it made possible. You threw out ideas about use of color, about the aesthetics, and his answer was, yes, I can do that, or you might want to think about that, but just the avenues that it opened up were great.
Mm. And yeah, I'm involved in a digital project, so just out of interest, really, is it a system where you can have you uploaded material yourselves into it, or have you sent data in sheets or something to someone else to import, or just be interested to know a bit more about the process?
Well, originally it was a spreadsheet, and then it was a kind of WordPress platform, and then it was re-exported to a spreadsheet for Mitchell to work through it. So really, it's at the base, it's quite a simple structure with many columns. But yeah, WordPress was our kind of intermediary, and then Mitchell has worked up a sort of bespoke interface from that. I don't know if that's helpful.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Dean Weathers a bit more about the gender genre gender tagging. So DM mentions the idea of the trickster figures. Let's have a look. So trickster figures who access social opportunities that would normatively be denied to speakers. DM's talking about 20th century examples, but have you found complaint poetry using or playing with gender in that similar kind of way of subverting gender expectations, perhaps?
Well, and one of the examples is the Psalms. I mean, it's not really a trickster, but of course, there's that's really the eye of the Psalms is at once King David and the believer, whoever they may be. And I think that's where we've really seen that kind of mobility in terms of gender. But you also do get it in some of the amatory complaints with the shepherds, I think. Yeah. But I would say the Psalms are the ones where you get the most mobility, and where that whole category of speakers gender kind of breaks down in that area. But all of this is about so many complaint poems are about the performance of gender in one way or another. And we, in the traditional idea of complaint as male authored but female voiced, you get that kind of ventriloquy into the prosopopeia of the female speaker. So it's exactly that kind of narrative cross-dressing that I think the genre is interested in. Michelle?
Yes. Complaint poetry really does foreground issues around voicing who's speaking, and sometimes positive heroes as well, and audience, and the interaction between the two. So what we've tried to capture with the different distinctions is that type of complexity and often indeterminacy of speakers as well, but also trying to capture a sense of the speaker as a space that can be inhabited, rather than fully determined, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and that is also related to complaint as a very performative mode as well. So that idea of performance and impersonation.
Sorry, could I just ask whether or not you've worked with any performers, or it's just DM here, just dropping in, worked with any actual contemporary performers to try and, reenact or bring the database to life? Because I think it would be really fascinating to hear the poems, the complaint poems sung or spoken.
That is a very lively strand in early modern studies, and Sarah Ross, who is in the room, I'm not going to out her. She has, for the monograph that we're writing, she has worked a lot on complaint as songs. So yeah, DM, that might be an area for development in the future, for future collaboration. And I don't know, Sarah, have you begun collaborating with anyone on complaint? You can, as performance, you can just put it in the chat if you like.
Can you hear me? I was actually trying to turn on my camera, but it doesn't seem to be working. It's being kind to me, but I think you can hear me, can you?
Yeah. definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that it's a really great question, and as Jake and Michelle have both directed, us to, complaint is all about impersonation. And one of the things that I think we discovered in putting together the database was just how diverse the voices and the personae were that women, writers and transcribers and performers, were taking on through complaint. So song has been a really important strand in this material, both in the work that Michelle has been doing and the work that I've been doing. So Michelle, Ros, Jake and I have all had sort of slightly different focuses, I guess, through this data, but song absolutely. And Michelle has been looking at some 16th century kind of Tudor context songs, and I've been looking primarily at song in the kind of early 17th century period. And women are taking on, if I just speak to what I've been doing in the early 17th century, women are taking on voices in song, which, work across a whole range of different personae. So men, I'm thinking about a Lady Margaret Weems song where she voices the ghost of the Duke of Buckingham. There's an incredible kind of playfulness and openness about the personae that women are speaking through and performing. In terms of working with performers, I've relied quite heavily on and worked with the material that Katie Larson has been doing. So her book on the matter of song has a series of recordings that she herself performed, and there are a lot of other available recordings of a lot of the song material that we're using. So we've certainly drawn on that. We did do a song performance here in Wellington at a conference a couple of years ago. So the musical language of complaint is something that we're also thinking a lot about in the monograph that we're writing that comes out of this, the way that musical figures and motifs are also used as kind of almost taggable versions of complaint rhetoric. That would be a whole other layer to this database. So yes, those are aspects that we're drawing on very much. It's a very rich vein.
Yeah, it sounds great. I want to go to a concert.
Yeah.
And howl along.
Yeah. But there's quite a lot of material available. Katie's are sound recordings only. There's another, sorry, I haven't got it at the tip of the forefront of my mind, but Elizabeth Davenant's songbook has also been performed. And Deanne Williams and another group of researchers at the University of Toronto are doing a project as well, and they've got quite a lot of YouTube videos of performances which are readily available. There's really exciting stuff going on, I think, in song. I'd also direct you, there's a lovely article just forthcoming in the next issue of Paragon, which is a journal that Ros and I edit, by Una McIlvenna on ballads and songs about war in the 16th and 17th century, and she's focusing quite a lot on mothers as personae and voices of complaint in that context.
Fantastic. Can we just come to Alison Searle, who's had a hand up for a little while? Thank you, Alison.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's a fabulous resource and I'm enjoying listening to the conversation so much. My question's really about the intersection between the digital process and the I'm not turning my video on because I'm doing childcare during half term. I've got building work in the background, just to explain why I'm refusing that invitation. It's about the aesthetics and the questions around how you define agency and the choices that have to be made as a result of engaging in a generous interface. And I found that fascinating, and I'm wondering if that's going to feed its way into the written monograph. I'm not sure what you do when it's 3 people, because doesn't seem quite right, but I love the fact that a monograph is being written by 3 people. Is that kind of a process of engagement and interaction being written into the way you're thinking about what's happening in terms of functionality and in terms of intellectual categorization and realization? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, and I think that's what I was trying to get at in the presentation, that you know, there have been various publication projects running alongside the index, including, and I'll hold it up again, the wonderful collection of essays on complaint. And certainly these kinds of issues around, particularly related to the idea of prosopopoeia as a type of impersonation that is also moving and persuasive and effective, makes you think about the relationship between voice, gender, and body in quite complex and complicated ways. And that did feed into the discussions that we had when we were thinking about how to, you know, the type of search terms that we would use. Sarah, do you want to come in there? Because I also know...
Yeah, I'm not sure that I've got anything to add actually about, yeah. No, I don't know that I do. I mean, the collaborative process, yeah, there's a, yeah, don't worry, no, I'm not being very articulate, it's too early.
I can see the sun is coming up behind you as our sun is going down. But yeah, I love collaboration.
Yeah.
it is just so stimulating, the kinds of conversations that we have all had together, but also the experience of making something together, and that process of making something is also incredibly instructive. You learn so much. It opens up all these kinds of questions in an often very urgent way, because you do have to come up with some kind of answer, even if as you realize that answer will be imperfect. And that in itself is really generative of thought, debate. It's such a fabulous process.
And perhaps just following on from that, Michelle, there's just one last question in the chat that I overlooked about, I guess, collaborating more widely and with external people. So there's a question, could other researchers potentially contribute or add new entries, or yeah, kind of suggest additions to existing material? Do you think that's something you'd build in at some point? Or
I would think that would be dependent on funding. Is that right, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd love to know of more examples, and yes, I think there is capacity to add things. Yeah, there have been some very hard decisions made, haven't there, about what we haven't included, all of those generative discussions. And at one point we had a category of we've got poems with complaint elements, but also we had poems that were kind of complaint adjacent. You know, it's an incredibly porous category, complaint, yes, and incredibly labile as well. So, you know, what to include and what not to include was very, very challenging in all sorts of ways. But there will be more examples. You know, we've always seen this as a foundation for other people's work as well as our own. So
yes,
we hope people continue to build on it.
Yes, lots of discussion whether a poem was complainty enough.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think we've reached 6 o'clock at UK time. Thank you for joining us as well, Sarah, and Michelle and Jake. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you. A lovely overview of the project and the kind of intellectual academic work behind it as well. And thank you everyone for the comments in the chats. There's lots of appreciation that you can look through as well. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the talk. Hope to see some people at our next event, which is in a couple of weeks' time, I think. Week's time, we have a seminar from Francesca Tonsini, who, sorry, Francesca, sorry, I hadn't realised, put two and two together. We'll be speaking about another database project around children's literature. Thank you very much
for having us.